a lot of loss of lives. But having said that, I want to say that this is a very, very important annual meeting. It takes on a different dimension because it is our 59th annual meeting of the bank, but it is also the 60th celebration of the establishment of the African Development Bank. So it's a time for us this year to, at this annual meeting, to reflect, for us to also look at the journeys that we've come through and what we have done and what we have achieved as a bank group over the last 60 years, but also at the time to think through some of the new challenges in the world and the role of the bank with financial architecture as we deal with those particular issues. And so I think, do you have a better microphone? Because this one kind of just goes off and off. Hello? Yeah, it's much better. So I was saying that we have to therefore think about what's the role of the African Development Bank as we look to the future. Yeah, we look at the back, we see what we've achieved, but a lot of big challenges are ahead of us, and we want to make sure that we are well positioned in dealing with that. And that's why the African Development Bank's annual meeting this year, the title of it is Africa's Transformation. The African Development Bank Group and the reforms of the global financial architecture. So you find us right inside of this, it's like a sandwich in which you find yourself as right in the middle of it, which is Africa's transformation, and I was talking about that. It's very, very critical. We are very critical for that to happen as a bank group. But as we make that happen, there are global issues that are coming up in which we have to review our business model, look at what we can do, look at how we can do it, and look at how we can do it with others to be able to achieve that. First, let me talk to you about Africa. As you know me, there's no doubt about it that you know that I believe strongly in Africa's potential. I believe in Africa's present. I believe in Africa's tomorrow. I believe in Africa's future. And why wouldn't I believe in that? It's not just because I'm president of the African Development Bank Group. I'm also an African. And I know what it is to develop and to develop with pride. We have the potential to be really great as a continent. And the issues are as follows. First is that where do you go in the world if you have the population that we have? You know, take a look at the population of Africa in terms of demographic potential that we have. You know, it's the size of China and the size of Europe taken together today. You know, that's what Africa's population really is going to be. And second is the demographic advantage with the youth that we have. We have 477 million young people below the age of 35. And that means that Africa will be the workforce of the world in terms of the young people, in terms of skills, in terms of capacity, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of innovation to be able to take on the world in the labor market, but also a lot of opportunities that are out there in the world. We cannot miss that. Third, we talk today about the whole issue of energy transitions. Globally, we've been talking about global energy transitions. Of course, we should, because everybody's worried about continued CO2 emissions and the need for us to contain that through energy transitions and moving into more renewable energy. Well, two things I want to say about that. Africa will drive the global agenda on renewable. But that sunshine is not just for cool, just enjoy yourself. That sunshine is 11 terawatts of solar potential. That is the highest solar potential you have anywhere in the world. And the level of solar irradiation you have in Africa, it is the highest anywhere you will find in the world. So therefore, as the world now transitions into renewable energy, Africa will be front and center in terms of harnessing the power of renewable energy to drive our world. And as you know, there's a lot of interest in looking at green hydrogen, looking at green ammonia and all of that, which are very, very going to be driving the world, whether it's fertilizers, whether it is jet fuels and all of those things. All those things are going to require using renewable energy, which is solar. And so I just want to say that in terms of Africa's positioning in influencing and shaping the future of the world in energy transition, it's going to be very, very significant. The second part of that is what happens with regard to green metals that you have to do that. Okay, and so Africa today has 90% of all the platinum in the world. You know, it has well over 66, 70% of all the copper that you have in the world, 50% of all the other metals, whether it's nickel you're talking about, whether it is lithium that you're talking about. Africa has massive amount of these natural metals. Well, these natural metals are the ones that are going to determine the future of electric vehicles in the world. And so how Africa harnesses that for its own transformation is going to be very, very critical, but also very critical for how Africa positions itself globally to play in those value chains. And so there are potentials, there are opportunities, there are positioning issues for Africa within the context of those global electric vehicles and battery energy storage systems that you have in the world. Now let me turn to agriculture. We have to feed roughly 9.5 billion people by 2050. Feeding them is going to require a lot of land. Well, roughly 65% of all the uncultivated arable land, yet uncultivated in the world, is not in the United States, it's not in China, it's not in Europe, it's not in Latin America, it's not in the Caribbean. It is in Africa. So what Africa does with agriculture is going to determine the future of food in the world. So these are the things that when you talk about transformation, Africa's transformation will have to happen not with what Africa does not have. It has to happen with what Africa has. And how Africa harnesses those are the things that are going to drive its fast-paced transformation. Let me also say that when you take a look at African economies, we all are in the world today where we have a lot of headwinds to global economic growth and development. You have it happening because of a lot of factors. First is climate change. We are right here. I just said to you at the beginning how important that, how devastating that has been. Africa loses $7 to $15 billion a year to climate change. If that doesn't change, that's going to grow to roughly $40 billion a year by 2030. And that means that we are losing a lot of our potential for something we did not cause. Because Africa did not account for more than 3%, maximum 3-4% of cumulative emissions. But it is suffering today disproportionately from the negative consequences of climate change. And so tapping into that economic potential transformation that I talked about is going to hinge on how the global financial system supports Africa to adapt to climate change, and how it supports Africa to build resilience, to recover. I just talked about Kenya from those climate change efforts. So those are going to be very, very critical issues that will determine Africa's future. Because today you have extremes. I was in Tanzania when they were having the 6-year celebration of the Union. And I was sitting with 3 leaders. One was from Malawi, Vice President of Malawi. And he was really talking about the fact that there was drought ever. Zimbabwe, they were having very serious drought. The president there declared a national emergency with regard to drought. On the other side, I was talking to the Prime Minister of Mozambique, where they're having floods in Mozambique. And you also have in Kenya, where they also have floods. So you have extreme weather patterns. But one thing is clear, that the climate change buffeting effects are increasing both in terms of frequency, in terms of scale, and in terms of intensity. And therefore, Africa's economy's future is going to depend on building resilience to these particular shocks, because climate change is really devastating the whole of the continent. Now, let me talk about the economic issues about Africa. Because when we talk about Africa's transformation, you need to have growth, and then you need to have development. So when you take a look at our growth, we're still recovering, as the rest of the world is, from the tapering effect of COVID-19. Those effects are still there. I know individuals talk about long COVID, which is what affects your lungs, but there's also economic long COVID, which is the fiscal effects continue even long after the virus itself, it's gone. But nonetheless, Africa is recovering very well from those effects. Last year, the GDP growth rate for Africa last year was 3.1%. This year, we estimate it will be about roughly 3.7, 3.4, 3.4 or 3.7% this year. And then next year, we project it will be about 4.3%. So in terms of real growth rate, Africa is doing well. And most importantly is, if you want to see how resilient you are, just look at how the rest of the world is, right? Today, 10 out of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world, despite all these headwinds that I've just talked about, are in Africa. So African economies are resilient in recovering from the impacts of climate change, but not just climate change, but also geopolitical pressures, risks that have come out of Ukraine, Russia war in Ukraine, and also out of the challenges of debt that you find many African countries facing. Now, let me talk a little bit about the issue of the debt question, because you will ask me, I'm sure, questions about that. Because, African countries are disadvantaged in many ways. They have very limited fiscal space because of the COVID-19 that have actually gone down. At the same time, many of the countries are actually right now having their currencies depreciate. And as those currencies depreciate, it means the cost of financing their dollar-denominated or euro-denominated debt continues to rise. And that is a big problem. And at the same time, as those things happen, because most of the economies depend on import of goods and services, intermediate goods, and all of that, machinery and all of that, it means you also have imported inflation. And so we have a situation in Africa where inflation levels have actually gone up, and you have a heightened inflation level in Africa. Easy for people, because you can have the economy growing, but what matters is the disposable income of the individuals. And so there's quite a lot of work that still needs to be done. I want to rejoice in the fact that we are resilient, and we should actually acknowledge that we are resilient, but given the high level of poverty we have in Africa, we still have long ways to go. In other words, what I'm saying is that the real GDP growth rate has to be much higher, given our high population growth rate, for us to be able to lift a lot of more millions of people out of poverty. One area that has actually contributed to this, maybe two areas that have contributed to this particular problem, of course, is what has happened with regard to the issue of food. The global climate change, but also the challenges from Russia's war in Ukraine. The production and the supply of food, in particular wheat, in particular maize, and also soybeans. And that's what Africa depends on. In fact, where we are today in East Africa, probably almost 80 to 90% of the imports of wheat are coming from those two countries. And it was very shocking for me to find that out during as that unfolded. And what we did as African Development Bank is we are a very, very responsive bank. We're not just a financial institution that just simply write checks and walk away and say, And so when this happened, of course, the food crisis was looming on the continent. I remember I was called for to give a testimony to the U.S. Senate on Foreign Affairs, and I asked the question, what should Africa do? What will Africa do? And I said, I don't believe that for food. What Africa has, with the potential it has, it must. And I'm delighted to say that we've been able to do that. But beyond that is the political will to drive that transformation of Africa that we are talking about. And one good example of it was what happened last year with the African Development Bank. We organized, on avait organisé, you say, il y a les gens des Sénégalais qui sont ici, on avait organisé le sommet sur comment nourrir l'Afrique l'année passée. Ça a été organisé à Dakar, sous la présidence effective de M. Macky Sall, mon très grand ami, M. le Président Macky Sall, et moi-même, on avait organisé ça avec l'Union africaine. Et nous avons eu la participation de 34 pays africains, chefs de l'État africains. Et pourquoi ils sont venus? Ils sont venus parce que on ne peut pas continuer à dire que nous avons un potentiel. On ne mange pas potentiel. Il faut dégager la potentialité que nous avons là. C'est la raison pour laquelle nous avons organisé ça. Et ça a été bien passé. Et ce que je voudrais dire, c'est que nous avons mobilisé beaucoup de ressources pour permettre les pays africains d'aller plus loin dans la transformation de l'agricole, le secteur agricole, qui est fondamental d'ailleurs, de transformer nos économies dans une façon plus équitable. And that's how we were able to we raised from that summit $72 billion, collectively, globally. That is the largest ever in the history of Africa towards dealing with any issue that we were able to mobilize globally. And I'm saying that to make one point. That point is this. African Development Bank, I said Africa's transformation, African Development Bank, and the global financial architecture reforms. We don't work alone. I don't even know how to work alone. We work with others to get things done. And we are able to pull all of that together globally to get $72 billion for African economies to be able to do their agriculture. So that's on that part of that. The other part, which is critical for Africa's economic transformation, is energy. You cannot industrialize in the dark. You cannot be competitive in the dark. And you cannot grow economies when you have no power. Electricity is the lifeblood in the body. It's like the blood in your body or mine. You either have it, you live. You don't have it, your economy dies. It's that simple. There's no two ways about it. And we as African Development Bank, since I was elected president in 2015, I took it very seriously because I knew that without electricity, we're wasting time. And we launched what's called the New Deal on Energy for Africa. Since we launched that in 2016, the average access of electricity on the continent was 32%. We moved that to 57%, just within a very, very short period of time. And now at the spring meetings of the World Bank, myself and Ajay Banga, the president of the World Bank Group, got together and announced to the world that we will connect 300 million Africans to electricity by 2030, collectively between the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And when you see the president of the World Bank and I walking that way, when was the last time that you saw that happening? And the reason for that is because the times have changed. No single institution, I don't care how much money you have, is going to be able to solve the challenges that we face. It's only by working together. And my bank staff know me that my principle is what I call the baobab approach. You go to an African village, you have a baobab tree there, right? You try and put your hands around it, you can't. But if you join your hands with other people around that tree, you can put your hands around it. That's what we do as African Development Bank. Baobab approach, work together with others to accelerate actions that will allow Africa to fast-track its own economic transformation. And so when the world, Ajay Banga and I launched that, that would be totally transformational. Just think of Africa would look like, And that I want to link back to the other part of the change or reforms of the global financial architecture by saying that it's not just the architecture that needs to change. The people that are in the architecture also need to change. We need to have a way of working together collaboratively, cooperatively, and effectively to deliver great results. The people we serve don't care about our flags. And people who know me know I don't care about flags. Nobody eats your flags. Everybody wants results. So let's work together, collaboratively and cooperatively, and deliver the results. But great things are happening with regard to that work. And I also want to tell you the stories that we hear sometimes about Africa's transformation when you look at things in the Sahel. On prend le Sahel, les gens disent non, ça ne marche pas. Il y a des problèmes là-bas. Oui, je ne dis pas qu'il n'y a pas de problème là-bas. Mais il y a la détermination de sortir les défis là. Ça, c'est fondamental. Et la transformation des pays sahéliens dépendra de ce qu'ils font avec l'énergie renouvelable. L'énergie est fondamentale pour eux au niveau de l'irrigation solaire, au niveau de la transformation des minerais qu'ils ont beaucoup, au niveau de la transformation du secteur agricole, pour créer de l'emploi, pour transformer le milieu rural pour eux, pour rendre les pays sahéliens plus résilients. C'est fondamental d'avoir l'énergie. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle moi je suis fier de ce que nous faisons. C'est notre programme qui s'appelle Desert to Power, qui est un programme qui vise à la construction d'énergie solaire, centrale solaire, de 10 000 mégawatts, qui donnera l'accès à l'électricité pour 250 millions de personnes. So that's Desert to Power. 250 million people will get access to electricity through the solar, 10,000 megawatts of solar. So that's the kind of thing that I believe it's going to transform Africa very, very much. But let me come back to some other things that are fundamental to Africa's transformation. One is infrastructure. Infrastructure is just like the backbone in the body that you have and I have. If you have a good backbone, you stand up straight. If you don't, you can't. That is what it is. Having ports, having rail, having power transmission line, having transport corridors, having digital infrastructure. Those are the things that actually make economies to work. And that is what we do best at the African Development Bank. You know, we are the largest financial institution that is financing infrastructure on this continent. Since I became president, maybe about almost 9 years now, we've done roughly about $50 billion of investment in infrastructure, from rails to ports to airports to digital infrastructure to transport corridors and all water and sanitation and all of that. And so we will continue as African Development Bank to push more for infrastructure. And that is why we launched something called Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, called AGIA, Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. That alliance is to mobilize $10 billion of private sector financing into infrastructure, but green infrastructure. Because Africa is still developing its infrastructure, so it can't afford to have space to use green infrastructure. So whether you're talking about desalination, whether you're talking about transport systems, whether you're talking about renewable energy, that's what. And I just came back from G7 meeting of finance ministers and of the governors, central bank governors, and they were highly complimentary of what we're doing in Africa and gave great support to the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. But having said all of that, you'll probably ask me, Africa's transformation will have to depend on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Yeah, it will. But I will be precise to say the following, that we need to turn that Africa Continental Free Trade Area potential into reality. And to do that requires that we have industrial policies that will allow us to have industrial manufacturing that allows us to specialize in value chains in which we have comparative advantage, both for national, regional, and global markets. Now, if we don't, it will be a very bad mistake, because simply trading is not enough. It's not the first time we've been trading. We've been trading forever. Our great-great-great-great-grandfathers were trading. But if I am trading with you, maize, and you're trading with me, sorghum, in a free trade zone, both of us are going to be both competitively and efficiently poor, because we are not moving into manufacturing. And so I'm saying that because industrial manufacturing must be at the core of that Africa's economic transformation. And that must be because it is an outward-looking industrial manufacturing stance that allows Africa to expand its exports around the world. And so when I think about infrastructure at the bank, it's not just about, I want to connect that village to that village. No. What are the corridors? What are the strategic infrastructure platforms we must have that will allow Africa to stand strong and be competitive? And that's what we are doing at the African Development Bank. I'll give you a few examples of some of those. Take, for example, the Lobito Corridor. The Lobito Corridor is a corridor that is linking Angola to Zambia and linking it to DRC Congo. And that's a corridor in which the African Development Bank is putting in $500 million on the Zambia side to be able to construct that particular corridor, working very closely with the US government and the Africa Finance Corporation. Take, for example, the Lagos-Abidjan Highway, $15.6 billion. We've mobilized all of that, interest for it, commitment to it, to be able to do it. Think about the Central Corridor for railway, linking Tanzania all the way to Burundi and DRC. That's about almost $3.5 or $3.4 billion that we are trying to raise to make it happen for them. All I'm trying to say is this: we need infrastructure, but more importantly, we need connectivity. We need to be able to connect our countries to each other. That's the only way we are going to be able to move. And I am sure you all are media houses. You've seen what my friend Aliko Dangote said recently, that he needs about 35 visas to be able to move around Africa. And that doesn't make any sense. There's just no way you can trade. There's no way you can be competitive, or you can have a regionally integrated market if people cannot move. So there has to be soft side to the economic transformation we're talking about. The ease of movement, labor mobility. It's very, very important how skills move from one country to the other. It's very, very important. And so I just want to say that that's the issue. And I did say something about the issue of debt before I went into all those areas. I want to say a few things about it before I open it up for you. But I'll say the following with regard to the issue of debt. You have a situation wherein, like between 2014 and 2024, where we are, maybe 19 African countries issued Eurobonds well over $200 billion. And of course, things were easy at the time. That you have low interest rates, and therefore people took advantage of that, which is fine. But today with devaluation, with also the contractionary monetary policy you have now back in the EU zone or in the US, the cost of servicing debt has gone off the roof. And so the critical issues that we need to manage are as follows, to make sure we build resilience for that transformation. First is that we have to make sure that it's not just about countries borrowing. They need more concessional financing. They need more concessional financing. Most of the borrowing that you see is commercial, private sector lending, Eurobonds or commercial lenders. So that's the first thing. And so second is also to make sure that there's a lot more efficiency in the use of expenditures, public expenditures for what those loans are being borrowed for. I mean, if you take a loan, you can have what I call hamburger loans. So something I eat today and it's gone. Or I can use that same credit card and I can invest in a house or real estate or something. So productive investment with loans that actually helps economies to grow, they're fine. There's nothing wrong in debt, but you just shouldn't be having bad debt. That's you and I take debt all the time. It's how we manage that debt that's important. The third I want to say is that the global financial architecture itself needs to be changed to be able to make sure that African countries are not penalized, especially when they access global capital markets. Let me explain myself here, and it's a very fundamental issue you will hear right through these annual meetings. And that is the so-called Africa risk premium. You hear it all the time. The Africans are borrowing, countries are borrowing more at high premium rates, yield curves above those of others that have similar ratings as African countries. So what I mean by that is there needs to be a fairer assessment of Africa's risk, because UNDP shows that if Africa's risks are properly and fairly estimated, that African countries will save $75 billion a year just in debt service that they have. So there's a big agenda when we talk about the global financial architecture, is the whole issue of how we look at the proper assessment of Africa's risk and so on. And of course, you all know that we've been working very well on the issue of the special drawing rights, and I'm pleased that together with the Inter-American Development Bank and the IMF, that the board of directors of IMF approved that, which is a hybrid instrument that will allow the stretching of those SDRs to be able to lend more. I'm pleased that the board approved $20 billion as a limit for the rechallenging towards hybrid capital for use by multilateral development banks, for example. And it's just this simple. Those SDRs can be leveraged by 4 times, and that $20 billion will become $80 billion. And just tells you the resources you need faster for development. The last thing I would say about Africa, which you will hear throughout our meetings today, for the next few days, is how Africa mobilizes domestic resources for its development. Because it's not just about loans, it's about how you mobilize resources for development. But this much I will say, that if you are simply taking more money, water, and you're putting water into a basket, it can never be full. So it's not just about what goes in, it's the efficiency in which you manage it, the losses you prevent, and also some of the illicit capital flows and some of the money we lose to corruption and all that. We also have to deal with it. So in the next 4 days, these are some of the issues that you'll be hearing. Our chief economist is here, Professor Urama. You will hear a lot from him throughout this week about Africa, the different growth patterns in different regions of Africa, and so on. You'll also hear quite a lot from us as we think about agriculture, as we think about infrastructure, as we think about energy, as we think about debt, and as you think about issues of investing in women and in boys, in the youth. You will hear a lot of those throughout these annual meetings. Now let me end by saying how proud I am to be working for a continent that has hope, and how much I feel, and my team know this. This, for me, as president of the bank, I have great staff. This is not a job for us. It is a mission. It's a responsibility that we have. 60 years ago, founders of this bank set up this bank to help us move Africa forward. And we have moved Africa forward in many ways. But today we are a very solid, we're a global financial institution today. We're not just an African institution. We're a global financial institution that's bringing innovation to the marketplace of reforms of global financial architecture. The bank launched a hybrid capital of $750 million, the first hybrid capital ever issued by any multilateral development bank was issued by the African Development Bank, oversubscribed by $5 billion. The bank is innovating when it comes to the use of leveraging its balance sheet. We actually did synthetic securitization. What that means in simple terms is, it's like sometimes you go to a doctor and they keep telling you some names out of medical books. You think your situation is worse than it really was. But what I'm really saying is you take risks off your balance sheet for sovereign operations and non-sovereign operations, and you give it to somebody else. You give it to private sector. We are the first and the only multilateral development bank to be able to do that for sovereign and non-sovereign operations, which allows us to free up more than $10 billion to lend more. What I'm saying is that we are celebrating our work, our achievements, mindful of the great task ahead of us, but undeterred, knowing fully well that we have the capacity, the ability, and the support of our shareholders to continue to innovate, to move Africa forward relentlessly. Let me once again welcome you to the annual meetings of the African Development Bank. For those of you that priorly followed me, I spoke to the All Africa Media Group. Are here, many of you are here. That's because I really believe that you are the ones that have the duty, the responsibility, the moral obligation to talk about all of the things that are happening, Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank, and of course, the reforms of the global financial architecture. I have no doubt you do justice to that this week. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, for that insightful presentation. And I'm sure you've learned a lot, some of which you may have known, but I think the elaboration and the details Mr. President has shared with us makes it all clearer, and perhaps will inform the kind of questions you're going to ask or comments you're going to make, and even the write-ups you're going to do. So let's go into questions. We'll go in that order, 1, 2, 3. So we'll see how we, and we'll try to balance gender balance as well. So we'll start here. If you give, we'll take 3 questions to go. The gentleman with at the back here, yes, where you are. And then the next the microphone will go to you raised your hand first, and then to the gentleman in the blue shirt. So you and the, let's go. Your name and organization. Thank you. Microphone, please, for him.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My question this afternoon is very simple. I want to know what are African countries.
And the name, please.
All right, Jimmy Mbogo from Citizen TV here in Kenya. My question is, what are African countries proposing to be the future of the global financial architecture?
Can I just? Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Adesina. Marion Dwe for AFP News Agency. I have two short questions. The first one going back to the debt issue. There were a lot of warning signs last year about the debt failure stress. Is it improving this year? Are things easing up regarding debt failure? And the second one is, what's the stand of AFDB on oil investment? Is AFDB helping countries that want to start oil production, for instance, which can be very crucial for them? Is AFDB helping in the upstream sector and maybe in the downstream as well with refineries and other critical infrastructure like that?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. My name is Bosin Amofaye. I work with Arise News in Channel in Lagos, Nigeria. My first question is, what will be the crux of the new 10-year vision for the AFDB? You having served 9 years and you're just about at the exit door. So what will be the vision for the next 10 years? What will be the crux of that? And how much of what you're leaving behind as your tenure expires next year will be part of the AFDB going forward? And what will you consider as your main legacy for the past decade of the AFDB?
Okay.
Jimmy, yeah? Yeah. For Citizen, you asked about was Africa's views on the global financial architecture. Africa wasn't there when the global financial architecture systems were being developed. And therefore, the Bretton Woods systems were developed without Africa. And that's been the rule ever since then. One of the big things that Africa is asking about is Africa needs more voice, and Africa needs participation at the table that has to do with global issues. Africa will not be a bystander in institutions and on issues and on platforms that affect its own development globally. And I give two examples for that. One is the IMF. I want to commend the IMF for responding to these particular needs of African countries, because now IMF has created a third seat for Africa at the IMF board, and this is very, very important to have. And I think that's one of the big issues I would say that you find. The second is what Africa is not happy about with the global financial architecture is that a global financial architecture, in particular in terms of climate finance, it's not addressing Africa's issues. Because to actually deal with Africa's own climate issues, Africa receives today $30 billion in terms of climate finance for itself. But Africa does need $277 billion a year to tackle that climate change. So you can see the big gap, and you here in Kenya, you've seen all the challenges. So the global financial architecture, as far as it has to do with global climate finance is under delivering for Africa. And that is why for us at the African Development Bank, I'm not just going to hold that and say, well, we're going to keep on complaining. I'm not somebody who complains. I look for solutions the best I can. And what we decided to do is basically two things. First is that we, as a bank today, we have committed to reach $25 billion in climate finance for Africa by 2025 as a bank. And that means 40% of our own financing will go to climate finance. That's the benchmark we set. But we've already exceeded that. We're probably about 47% of our financing today going to climate finance. And most of that is going to climate adaptation. The second thing we've tried to do in response to that particular issue is during the African Development Fund, which is the concessional financing window of the bank, we created something called the Climate Action Window. And we are the first concessional financing institution in the world that will have a climate action window to deal with these external shocks that I'm talking about. And it was capitalized at initially at $429 million. And we had a lot of support from Netherlands, from the UK. We got a lot of support from Norway, and we got also from Switzerland and others, and Germany in particular, to help us set this up. And so these are the things that we are doing to be able to respond to that second part of it. The third part of it, where Africa, it's not being well served by the global financial architecture, has to do with how debt resolution is done. When it comes to issue of debt and debt resolution, don't forget that Africa in the 90s, when we had the multilateral debt relief initiative, and we also had the highly indebted debt, poor countries, we lost a decade because it took forever to negotiate anything. And so we are pleased that there's a G20 common framework, which I strongly support, which the African Development Bank strongly supports, the G20 common framework. It's helping to bring creditors that are the private creditors with the official creditors together to negotiate on comparability terms, what are the terms of the debt restructuring that's going to be done. Now, I understand it's a very difficult process because you have Paris Club members, you have non-Paris Club members, and you have commercial debtors, and their needs are quite different from those of official creditors. But it's helped. It's helped with Chad. It's helped with Zambia. It's helped with Ghana. And it's working also on Ethiopia in putting together the various credit committees. That said, that process, everybody agrees, is too slow. If you're going to, if you have somebody that is bleeding and you want to save their life, stop the bleeding faster. Because by the time that you actually do it, they may be dead. And so what you find African countries asking for is a speedier implementation and execution of those global mechanisms to deal with the issue of debt. But this much I would say in terms of response from Africa, because I'm somebody who believes very strongly in the need for Africa to always have indigenous or endogenous solutions to its own issues. Today, if you take a look at how much it's going to cost us as a continent to refinance all this debt that I'm talking about, it will probably take us this year, Africa will need about $20 billion to refinance that debt that's due. Probably need another $10 billion next year for the next several years, maybe 5 more years. But there is no global vehicle that can do refinancing of debt. IMF doesn't do refinancing of debt. And Africa is the only continent that does not have a risk participation agreement. There is European financial stability mechanism. There's the Arab mechanism. They have its Asia stability mechanism. Africa is bare. So whenever any shock happens, that leads to illiquidity and that can lead to insolvency, and that creates multiplier effects that affect several other countries. And so my view is we cannot always have Africa be like a patient that has malaria, and every time it goes into the hospital, is sent into the emergency ward. We need to have a place where Africa's immediate needs are quickly met that will complement the IMF's global safety net. Right now, that doesn't exist, and that's why the African Union tasked the African Development Bank and made that case to heads of state, the need to have an African financial stability mechanism that would provide a force buffer for African countries when you have shocks, and that will allow us not to have all the kind of problems we are having today. And so we are working on that particular issue with the global financial architecture. So let me leave it there. There are many more things I could say, but you can see that, and maybe one more thing that I could say that Africa has been talking about is the issue of the contingent financing facilities that are available globally. And that contingent one has to do with the special drawing rights. And I commend IMF, I commend all the great work that Kristalina is doing and all the terrific people they have there. But what happens was you had African countries receive only $33 billion out of $650 billion contingent financing. And so there's a lot of discussion going on now about how to relook at the quota mechanisms and make sure that the in future that is based on need, not just the amount of quota that you have, so that you don't have those that don't need it having more than those that actually need it. So those are some of the issues I think that Africa talks about, and our heads of state talk about, and I talk about. Marion, on the AFP, yeah, on the debt failure, you mean exactly what? So everybody can hear you. So what? Yeah, I just want to be sure I know.
Is there a risk of debt default in the coming years?
I just want to be sure that precise about. Yeah. No. You have some of the. Today you have 22 countries in Africa that are either at the high risk of debt, or that are probably in debt, high risk of debt itself already. And so the issue is default is not common in Africa. You have probably one or two isolated cases. So there is no issue about systemic default in Africa. What we have to think about is how to create more fiscal space and how to make sure that there are financial flows, positive financial inflows into those countries that far exceeds their outflows. That's what we have to do. And that means that we need to have a lot more concessional financing going to those countries. And why do I say that? Today, only about 44% of the total debt, maybe even more now, chief economist, it must be probably even more than that now, that's actually private sector debt and commercial debt. Sorry? 48%, yeah, that is. But if you go back to 2010, or 2000 rather, thereabout, it used to be about 54% of total Africa's debt exposure were bilateral debt. Today, it's 25%. Commercial debt was at that time 17%. Today, it's 48%. So you can see that the increase in commercial debt is long-term, not short-term, for high interest rate. And that leads to a lot of what you call the payment walls, overlapping payments that you have to keep on making. And so the solution to that, to avoid a crisis, as follows, in my view. First, make the common framework work faster. Second is to increase concessional financing to multilateral development banks. So take, for example, the African Development Fund, which is the concessional financing window of the bank, needs to get a lot more financing. And you also have IDA process that's also there, they also need to get more financing. So we need to actually make sure that we scale up a lot of the concessional financing facilities. The third thing, of course, is you hear quite a lot about the external debt, but we often forget that one of the problems we run into is that we are not doing enough lending in local currencies. Yeah? So we need to make sure that going forward, we do more lending in local currencies and therefore develop local capital markets to be able to mobilize capital for financing. So it's not everything that has to be a mismatch between your currency and then your earnings or your counterparties that you cannot pay because of your FX risks that you have. So I don't expect systemic risk at all of debt failure in Africa, but I do think that we need to also do things better to reduce. There's only so much a country can do running up a hill while carrying a pack of sand on its back. And so we have to make sure that we make it easier for countries to cope with many of this issue. Now, the question on my stand or our stand on oil investments, as African Development Bank, we don't invest in oil, and we don't invest in coal either. We invest today at the bank 80, I think what was it? Is it 85 or what is it? 83, 85% of all our financing in energy goes to renewable energy. So I always tell people, I don't need to be lectured about renewable energy. We're already maxed out in terms of that. However, I don't operate based on ideology. I operate on pragmatism. Because economies are not run by ideology, they should be run pragmatically. What I mean by that is that natural gas remains a fundamental part of the energy mix for Africa. Africa will not be able to industrialize without natural gas. And therefore, natural gas is also, by the way, in the nationally determined contributions that Africa signed on to in Paris. I was there. I was part of the people that helped make that happen for Africa. So I know what I'm talking about. So we can't change the goalposts and suddenly say Africa can't use natural gas. Why is it that Europe is using natural gas? Others are using natural gas. Why it suddenly become a bad thing for Africa to use natural gas? Africa needs natural gas for three things. One, energy. That is gas to power, to be able to have modular systems that can actually give us electricity. We still have 600 million people without access to electricity. And natural gas for power is a lot better than if you are using other polluting fuels. And so that we know that the reduction of emission is significant. And we never should forget that Paris was not about no emissions. It's about reducing emissions. And Africa will be reducing its emissions. Secondly is clean cooking. I was in Paris together with President Samia of Tanzania and Dr. Birol of the International Energy Agency, as well as Prime Minister Story of Norway. We co-chaired the summit on clean cooking in Africa. Today, we have 300,000 Africans, women, that die only because they are trying to cook a meal. Makes no sense. 300 kids on their back, 1,000, die also because of indoor pollution. I grew up as a kid blowing, I didn't start using glasses because I just suddenly got smart from university. As a kid, I was blowing charcoal. I was blowing into those things, and I knew the damage it did to my eyes. And here we are, 24th century. Why should people be cooking like that? And that's why, for us at the African Development Bank, we made a decision. We will allocate $2 billion to support clean cooking in Africa. And of course, that means that we're going to invest in liquefied LPGs, because LPGs is the fastest way, the cleanest way in which you can have women to have access to clean cooking energy like anybody else in the world. African women shouldn't have to die for trying to cook a meal, So that's just on that. And the other one, of course, is you need natural gas for fertilizers. And so those are the three things that we are talking about. So when you look at us using natural gas, it's natural gas to be able to do those things and all that. to boss from Arise, the crux of the 10-year strategy of the bank, the next 10-year strategy of the bank. When I was elected president, I had to ask myself a question. What will I do? How will I do it? And how will it move Africa forward? And how will we be held accountable? Those are the things that are very important for me. And that's how I came up with the high fives of the bank. To light up and empower Africa, to feed Africa, to industrialize Africa, to integrate Africa, and to improve the quality of life of the people of Africa. Since we started that in 2016, we rolled it out. It has had impact on more than 400 million people, whether it's in terms of access to electricity, water, sanitation, good health services, good transport services. Then, you know, in fact, sitting over there is Simon Mizrahi, my vice president. He used to run the Development Effectiveness Report. Simon, you can stand up. And he used to run the Development Effectiveness Report of the bank, which is rated globally in terms of how we measure and how we report our results. And that's why, I think 2 years ago, the African Development Bank was ranked as the most transparent financial institution in the world because of how we report and measure our results transparently about what we do. So, but when we had to now do the new 10-year strategy, our board of directors asked us to go ask the countries whether they want to continue the high fives that we've been doing so well on. And so we went, because we are a very consultative organization. And we ran surveys. We had town hall meetings. We went all over Africa. You guess what the countries told us? Go back and keep doing the high fives. Because the high fives, they consider them to be accelerators of Africa's development. We're not there where we need to be. But with the high fives, we will get there. Because even the United Nations Development Program agreed that if Africa were to run those high fives, Africa will achieve 90% of the Sustainable Development Goals. And Africa will also achieve 90% of the Agenda 2063, which is the Africa we want of the African Union. So that is it. So that tells you that the level of confidence that our countries have in Africa about what we do. You know, and I was just talking to some of the governors just before coming here at a meeting, the ministers. He said, never before have we been this clear about what we need to do, right? Sometimes people think it's like high five is high, right? It's precision driven. We do those things, electricity, food, industrialization, Africa will be completely different. So we continue. So I'm glad that our shareholders have that huge confidence in us. And last thing I want to say is, when you say, it's hard for me to start talking about legacy today. I still have time until last year, and I was talking to my governors. The way I work all the time. It's not a job, it's a mission. It's a responsibility I have to continue to. I work to the very last second, making sure that our staff and myself under my leadership continue to deliver. So if you ask me that question next year, I'll be able to answer it. But for now, I got lots of work to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. President. We'll take a couple more questions because Mr. President needs to leave at 5:30 for Dakar, the post-Dakar 2 session happening in Abadea's room, and it's important that you'll also go and see what's happening there. So, Solange, you've got one person at the back. The microphone will move at the lady at the back. We'll then come to the gentleman in red and then the lady here in front. Okay. We go for it?
Passion.
Yeah. Okay, yes, go on. Tu peux parler en français, please. Yeah, s'il vous plaît.
Je vous entends pas.
Bon, ok. Je suis Yolène Etouké du magazine Wari de TV5 Monde. Alors, je voudrais savoir quelles sont les perspectives pour la mobilisation des ressources financières en faveur du développement en Afrique. Merci.
Good evening. My name is Wairi Mojenga from the National Broadcasting House, that is KBC. And my question is on, has Africa lost the battle?
Sorry,
My name is Caroline Jenga, yes, from KBC. Has Africa lost the battle of illicit financial flow? And I'll zero in on illegal mineral trade, where you have talked about Africa being endowed with a lot of metals. Yet you have talked about how we are not able to participate in the powering of electric vehicles due to these minerals being smuggled out of the country. Now, why don't minerals mined in Africa stay in Africa, and how much can Africa move from raw material exports towards mineral value addition?
Okay, thank you. Let's come to the gentleman in red here and then the lady here as well.
Merci beaucoup, Salomon. Bonjour, Président. Je suis Télémi Kwame de Acturo, de microphone. Et je viens de Côte d'Ivoire. Cette année, le thème est un grand thème, transformer l'Afrique. Et vous l'avez si bien dit dans votre propos liminaire, on ne peut pas transformer l'Afrique aussi facilement face au changement climatique. Merci. Hello. Donc, on ne peut pas transformer l'Afrique aussi facilement face au changement climatique.
Il a changé le climat. You should give him the microphone back. That's a better microphone than what he has.
Sorry.
Talk about turning a solution into a problem. Yes.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup, Président. Il faudrait qu'on transforme aussi les micros. Donc, je disais qu'on ne peut pas transformer aussi facilement l'Afrique face au changement climatique, vous l'avez reconnu. Et les derniers événements récemment en Afrique, et notamment en Afrique de l'Est, ici au Kenya ou en Tanzanie ou à côté en Ouganda, beaucoup d'inondations qui ont fait partie beaucoup. Est-ce que la banque, aujourd'hui, dans les travaux qui vont démarrer, est-ce que la banque a un projet très clair et précis concernant donc ce qu'il faut faire pour la qualité des infrastructures, pour que quand il y a des pluies fortes, quand il y a le changement climatique, les infrastructures puissent résister plus longtemps? Je voudrais terminer en donnant l'exemple d'une ville ou d'un pays comme les Émirats arabes unis, Dubaï. Récemment, nous étions à Dubaï au mois d'avril et Dubaï a connu beaucoup d'intempéries. On peut dire aussi que ce sont les changements climatiques. Il y a eu beaucoup d'inondations, mais à la fin, quand l'eau s'est évaporée, les infrastructures sont restées presque intactes. Vous, au niveau de la BAD, qu'est-ce que vous allez faire concrètement pour que cela puisse s'améliorer? Je vous remercie.
Okay, merci. No, give the lady the microphone, please. Please, if you don't mind. And then very last, I know I forgot the other column there. We'll go to that lady there. But let's hear a question here first, then we'll come to you. Go ahead.
Bonjour, Dr Adesina. Samantha Ramsemi, RT en français. Le thème de cette année, c'est donc la réforme de l'architecture financière internationale. C'est une priorité également pour les BRICS. Est-ce qu'il faut considérer que l'agenda de la Banque africaine de développement s'inscrit dans celui des BRICS? Et est-ce qu'on peut considérer que la BAD amorce un virage multipolaire en direction donc, des pays du Sud global? Je répète tout. Est-ce que la réforme de l'architecture financière internationale concerne également les pays des BRICS? C'est une priorité pour ce bloc. Est-ce qu'on peut considérer que l'agenda de la Banque africaine de développement s'inscrit dans celui des BRICS? Et par ailleurs, est-ce qu'il faut aujourd'hui considérer que la Banque africaine de développement amorce un virage multipolaire en direction des pays du Sud global?
Okay, and then the lady right at the other end, please. The last question.
Yes, good evening, Mr. President. My name is Josie Mahachi from Germany's public broadcaster Deutsche Welle. The question I have for you might sound simple to many, but I would kindly ask you to break it down in a way that someone in my village in Gutumashingo in Sokoto might understand. There is a push for the global financial architecture. How would this reform look like in your perspective? And also, global financial architecture is seen to be so unequal, and many African leaders say it disadvantages the continent. What is AFDB doing to steer this equity, especially in agricultural projects in Africa? Thank you.
Bon, la question qui a été posée, la première personne, c'était où, là? Il n'est pas... Ah, OK. Le nom, c'est? Yelene, OK. Yelene, merci pour votre question. En ce qui concerne la mobilisation des ressources domestiques, si vous regardez aujourd'hui la situation en Afrique, peut-être 80-90% de nos économies sont informelles. Donc, pour pouvoir mobiliser les ressources domestiques, il faut transformer le secteur informel avec la formalisation. Et pour y arriver, il faut la digitalisation de l'économie. Donc, la collecte des impôts, les taxes et tout cela va accélérer si vous avez une digitalisation de l'économie. Ça, c'est fondamental. La deuxième chose qui est très importante, c'est que on dit qu'il faut augmenter le niveau de taxes. Vous avez bien compris ce que je dis? OK. Donc, on collecte les impôts et tout ça là. Mais quand même, la ratio de ces impôts-là par rapport au PIB en Afrique aujourd'hui, c'est presque 14,5%. Donc on dit, normalement, c'est bas pour les pays de pouvoir accélérer. Il faut que ça soit au moins 15% ou bien au-delà de ça. Mais il ne faut pas oublier quand même que nous avons beaucoup de personnes en Afrique qui sont dans la pauvreté. Donc, pour eux, ils ont besoin même de transferts pour pouvoir même subir. Donc, il y a cet aspect que ce n'est pas toujours direct. Même si je soutiens la nécessité d'augmenter ça, il peut avoir les effets d'inégalité un peu fortes, surtout avec beaucoup de personnes qui sont déjà pauvres. Mais je pense, si on élimine le flux illicite de capital de l'Afrique, qui est environ peut-être 89 milliards de dollars par an, ça c'est une épargne pour le continent qui est très, très important, à mon avis. Il y a aussi, let me say, when you take too much sugar, it leads to diabetes. And what I mean by that is this. When private sector wants to invest in Africa, Africa countries are constantly giving them massive amount of tax exemptions. So it's like that now creates an investment, in my view, that is too much sugar, that is almost causing diabetes. The countries have to rationalize their need to raise more resources from what they have. And so I think the days, if your economy is good, if you have good macroeconomic stability, you need some incentives, but you don't need to make it too much sugar that it creates diabetes. And so that's what I'm saying, that they need to make sure that they are not giving away too much. And some of this happens parce qu'ils n'ont pas la capacité institutionnelle, humaine, de faire la négociation avec les gens qui veulent faire l'investissement chez eux. Par exemple, quelqu'un veut, il y a un glissement de gaz, un glissement de pétrole, je ne sais pas moi. Et les gens signent le papier, vite, comme ça. Mais il y a une asymétrie au niveau du pouvoir entre les gens qui détiennent les ressources, les gens qui veulent avoir les ressources, et les gens qui s'approprient à leurs ressources. Et à la fin des choses, ils signent le papier qui n'est pas à leur intérêt. Donc, je pense qu'on a besoin de beaucoup de transparence, on a besoin de beaucoup de formation, renforcement de la capacité de faire la négociation. Et ce que nous faisons à la Banque africaine de développement. Nous avons une facilité qui s'appelle la facilité juridique de quoi? ELSF en français. C'est facilité juridique légale. Let me say it in English. Africa Legal Support Facility. And this facility, we have used it to help to, in 5 minutes again. We have used it to help countries to renegotiate their debt obligations, to renegotiate their, in terms of amount of taxes they need to collect, amount of royalties they need to collect when they sign a lot of natural resource deals that are not in their interest. And I'll give you one case. We helped one country to renegotiate what they signed. That saved them more than 93% of what they signed, just because they didn't know what they were signing. So all I'm trying to say is that when it comes to dealing with domestic resource mobilization, it is not only taxes that you need to do domestic resource mobilization. You need to be able to have your natural resources properly managed and make sure that you're getting, the countries are getting what they should be getting from their natural resources. That will solve a lot of the problems. J'espère que ça va. J'ai répondu à votre question. OK, merci beaucoup. KBC, whether Africa lost the battle on illicit capital flows. Where is, yeah, you know, illicit capital flows are not unique to Africa. You have illicit capital flows all around the world. And that's why the best way to deal with illicit capital flows is to make sure that there is transparency, there's cooperation across tax jurisdictions so that people cannot just move money from one place and go hide it somewhere else. And so it's not just an issue that's unique for Africa. So I wouldn't say the world has lost a battle on that. The world has a responsibility to make sure that the right systems, the right governance, the right tax regimes are being done in such a way that people can track and know where's the money going. And one of the things that is being discussed actually right now is whether we do need to have a minimum tax, corporate tax level that is all across the world. It's a conversation that is happening. And that way you cannot escape from one place to the other just because the tax rate is much lower in somewhere else. So I don't think that, but I do think we need to continue to work on that. We as African Development Bank support President Thabo Mbeki's panel on illicit capital flows, and we continue to work to make sure there's transparency in the reporting of taxes by corporations. And I will say this, just to close on that point. I think companies that are working in Africa, benefiting from Africa, must pay taxes in Africa. Africa can't be a freebie in which people just take things from. Let me say about your point about how can Africa move in terms of mineral value addition. You know, the thing, Caroline, is the fact that if you take, for example, today, the manufacturing of solar panels or battery energy storage systems, because countries such as DRC Congo have pretty much 70-90% of platinum. I mean, they are so rich in so many minerals that there was an analysis that we commissioned that was done by Bloomberg. And what they found was that the cost of making lithium-ion precursor batteries in Africa is 3 times less than making those batteries in China, Poland, or the United States. So what needs to be done is to make sure that Africa develops those value chains and that it develops joint ventures with those that have the skills, the capacity, and the resources and the experience to locate manufacturing plants close to the source of where the minerals are. And this will help in many ways. We have a lot of illegal mining that goes on. We have a lot of young kids that are actually being exploited to actually mine many of these resources. And the state doesn't collect any money from it. And this will solve a lot of that, create a lot of jobs, make sure that investment come into Africa in a very organized way, and also reduce the issue of tensions and conflicts that you have as people rush over natural resources. So I do think that that's why the African Development Bank is working with other partners, such as the Africa Finance Corporation and others, on how to make sure that we can do beneficiation to all of the minerals, the oil, the gas, the metals that Africa has. Look, my view is as follows. Those who export raw materials, the export of raw materials is the door to poverty. But value addition and processing and value addition to what you have is a highway to wealth. And I think Africa is pretty much tired of being poor. It needs to get smarter and add value to all of what it has. Barthélemy, vous avez demandé concernant le changement climatique et l'impact de ça sur l'infrastructure. Oh, bien sûr. Il était avec le président de Sierra Leone à Paris. Il m'avait dit, président Adesina, ça coûte beaucoup d'argent de faire l'infrastructure. Mais cette infrastructure s'est détruite par un seul cyclone. C'est tout. Et où on va trouver l'argent pour refaire ça? So the cost of that, it's very, very high. Donc, ce que nous faisons à la Banque africaine de développement, c'est qu'on a essayé de soutenir les pays africains, maintenant, de prendre en compte le changement climatique dans les désignes des infrastructures. Comment on va rendre les infrastructures plus résilientes au climat? Comment on fait les stress tests de ces infrastructures au cas où il y a une inondation, au cas où il y a un cyclone? Donc, la méthodologie change à cause de ça, parce qu'il faut avoir l'infrastructure qui est vraiment très résiliente. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle nous travaillons avec l'institut qui s'appelle le Centre global pour l'adaptation, Global Center on Adaptation in Netherlands, parce que nous avons un programme qui s'appelle, let me say it in English, it's called the African Adaptation Acceleration Program. It's a $25 billion program to build adaptation for Africa. And one of the things we are doing with the Global Center on Adaptation, they are providing support to us at the bank in our projects, infrastructure projects, to assess climate risks, to assess the resilience of bridges, the roads, and water treatment plants, energy plants, in case of climate change or floods, and how to build resilience. So, in fact, they are setting up what called resilience master classes, which are engineers in various countries to help them to be able to build more resilient infrastructure. And the other thing I want to say is we have something called the Africa Disaster Risk Insurance Facility. That facility pays the premiums for countries to insure themselves against catastrophic risk events. So when those risk events happen, the facility pays back the cost of the damage to the countries. And it's working very, very well. And we are scaling that now up to about $1 billion. We plan to do $1 billion to be able to insure the countries with regard to that. Now, the reform of the global financial architecture, where's the question is from where? Yes. You want me to speak in Hausa, or you just say, I wasn't sure I heard you? Oh, Zimbabwe. Oh, Tinokutenda Baba Shagaraka. Tatenda. No, but you're not the one that asked me about the BRICS. Somebody else asked me about BRICS. Yeah. So let me explain it in English so that I'll be very, very clear about what I'm saying. The world is changing. The global south is becoming much more important. And you can see that in what has happened to the BRICS that you're talking about. Importance of Brazil, importance of India, China, all the countries that form Russia, all of them that form BRICS. And the BRICS emerged because of the importance of the global south. But I was in Saudi Arabia just 2 weeks ago, to also celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Islamic Development Bank Group. And of course, Islamic Development Bank, OPEC, and all of those, they are also institutions that are putting a lot of efforts into the importance of the global south. And even for us at African Development Bank, you know, today, we work very closely with all the financial institutions in Africa. As president of the bank, I go working to make sure all presidents, all CEOs of financial institutions in Africa, we lock hands together. It's not about your institution against my institution. It's how we pool our capacity, pool our resources, pool our influence, and our voice together, and our financing to scale up support for Africa. And I must tell you, today, in Africa, today, ourselves and those African financial institutions, whether it's AfriExim, the Trade Development Bank, the Development Bank of South Africa, the Africa Finance Corporation, and several others that are Badia, and so on, and West African Development Bank, there is no project, none, on this continent today that we cannot finance, not one. And that's to tell you that Africa is coming of age in terms of the kinds of financial institutions that it has, and its ability to have economies of scale and scope in supporting Africa. And that's the strength of South-South cooperation. I just came back from Brazil to see President Lula, and you're going to see a lot of partnership between Brazil and Africa in agriculture, in pharmaceuticals, and all of that. So all I'm saying is that the African Development Bank cooperates with all around the global south, and I don't see the world in a divisive manner as far as I'm concerned. I think if you go to the garden, you find different types of flowers there. You find rose flowers, you find all kind of carnation, you find all kind of flowers. It's the beauty, the diversity you find in your garden that makes it beautiful. And so it's the ability to harness diversity for the good of the world that we should be looking at. And last question to, and how with the global financial architecture, you asked me to explain that what it is. So the way I can explain it is as follows. You rent a house, and all of a sudden, your needs, let's say it's a 2-bedroom house, and your needs are expanding. So you have more beds, you have more furniture, you have more books, and the house can't contain you. And now you're looking for a way to expand. But if you don't have access to mortgage finance, you can't. You're stuck with it. Eventually, either you sleep on your luggage or your luggage sleeps on you. that is basically what the world is going through. Climate change, debt, urbanization, jobs, food security, inflation. All these are things that are adding into your flat, your two-bedroom flat. It's just piling and piling and piling. You need a break to be able to rent somewhere else or build somewhere else to be able to cope. Otherwise, you go under. That's basically what that global financial architecture reform is all about. Change it in such a way that a number of things are addressed. First, fairness, equity, justice, representation, and inclusiveness are very important, because those that were not there when those institutions were created, their voices have to be taken together now, that they need to be on the table, around the table, when that conversation now goes on about what happens in our world. Make space for Africa. And I'm delighted that that space was made for Africa at the G20. To have Africa Union now represent the G20, and more African countries need to be there. And I'll say this, I particularly, South Africa is there, and I believe Nigeria should be there around the table for G20. Now, the other thing that the global financial architecture does is also the balance between global and regional. For a long time, it's always been the global institutions. But today, the regional institutions that were set up like ourselves, even the way we've grown, we've become global institutions, but focusing on the needs of our own continent. We are marketing Africa to the world and bringing resources from the world to Africa. And so that balance between the existing institutions and the young institutions of those days that have now come on age is also how you balance that. Because the role and responsibility also has to make room for that and take that into consideration. And the last thing I want to say about that issue is what you said about how to tilt agriculture in particular to Africa. Look, I won't take too long because I can talk about agriculture all night. But I'll only say this. What Africa has that will make it globally competitive in the world today, the first thing it has is agriculture. And what it does with that agriculture will determine the future of food in the world, as I said. And I think the way to be able to tilt that is to make sure that we are investing more in raising productivity of agriculture and have a confidence that we can actually transform agriculture in a short period of time. I'll give you an example. Take Ethiopia, for example. We provided for Ethiopia heat-tolerant wheat varieties. You know, wheat is a temperate crop. So we provided for Ethiopia heat-tolerant wheat varieties in 2018. These heat-tolerant wheat varieties, coming from the program of African Development Bank, were cultivated on 5,000 hectares. Last year, those varieties were cultivated on 2.2 million hectares. And in less than 4 years, Ethiopia became self-sufficient in wheat. So if we can do that for Ethiopia, why can't we do it everywhere? What I'm trying to say is that we at African Development Bank realize the potential of Africa. And Bosan is here, you're all dealing with the issue of inflation and all of that. There is a limit to what you can use contractionary monetary policy to deal with inflation until it becomes a gun that you turn at yourself, that shoots at yourself. Because who's going to make an investment where your interest rates are off the roof? And yet, many of the things driving the inflation you see today are structurally driven inflationary issues. So go out there and produce the food. Go out there and make your energy systems work. That's what's driving a lot of inflation. It's not your monetary policy rate that's going to deal with that. And so what I'm trying to say is that when you produce your food, you're dealing with it structurally, and you bring inflation down. 65%, by the way, of the consumer price index is the price of food. So if you produce that food to bring it down, it'll be great for you. So I think that's all I'll say. I think we keep on investing, but let's keep on investing right. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much. It's good to see everybody.
Thank you so much, members of the press. Mr. President, thank you so much. I know you've got to rush, so thank you. We'll see you around, guys. More opportunities to interact with Mr. President and also Vice Presidents and other leaders of the bank. As I said, Dakar 2, post-Dakar 2, the session begins or is underway in Abadeas. Thank you.
But nowadays, we are taking just 2 hours.
Barabara itatu benefit kwa sababu tutaweka vitu nini kama
Hey, are you serving snacks? You serve snacks to the media? Yeah? Okay, members of the press, please feel free to come and have some refreshments. Thank you.
Development Bank Group, the Kenyan government, and other development partners. The project has transformed the road from a single carriageway to a 7-meter wide dual carriageway, incorporating grade separated junctions, footbridges, and an interchange. It connects Kenya to Ethiopia in the north and Tanzania in the south, forming part of the Cape to Cairo Trans-Africa Highway Corridor.